Dad had to leave home at age 15 to support the family. He found himself at Camp Mansfield in Vermont. As a 15-year-old, 3 years under the required age, he forged a birth certificate to get in. And he found himself being picked on because he hadn't started shaving, his voice hadn't changed. The older man called him Doris.
An excerpt from today's guest, who edited his father's memoir of life aboard a World War II Liberty ship and turned it into a page-turning book. Dr. Paul Gill is here to discuss Armageddon in the Arctic Ocean. I'm Robert Child, and this is Point of the Spear. Today's guest attended the University of Notre Dame and the University of Alabama School of Medicine. He practiced emergency medicine for 35 years and was a freelance medical writer for many of those years. His articles appeared in many outdoor magazines, and his books, The Ragged Mountain Press Guide to Wilderness Medicine and First Aid, and the Onboard Medical Handbook, were published by McGraw-Hill. His current book is called Armageddon in the Arctic Ocean, and Dr. Paul Gill joins us now. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Rob. I've been looking forward to it.
I have as well. Now, before we get into the story, the catalyst for your book was an unfulfilled promise you made to your father. I thought that was interesting. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, an unfulfilled promise, an unexpected request by my dad as he was near death in the year 2000. He was dying of lung cancer. He had been, as long as I could recall as a child and growing up, he had talked about a diary he kept during the voyage to Russia in 1942 with convoy PQ-18. He was third mate on the SS Nathaniel Greene, a Liberty ship. And every once in a while, he'd talk about the fact that he was going to write a book. It was going to be entitled Red Waters. He was going to talk about the terrible combat that he experienced, as well as his experience with communist Stalinist Russia. So Dad retired in about 1981 or two, and set about very studiously researching the material for his book and started writing. And he apparently got off to a good start. Then he ran into health problems, failing vision, about colon cancer. Various things came up that really made it very, very difficult for him to finish the book. So after almost 20 years of effort and repeated efforts on my part to help him, because I've done some freelance magazine writing and published a couple of books on medical topics. I felt I could lend him a hand, but he was a very proud man, and this was his book, his project, and thank you, but no, I'll do it.
Right.
But finally, with fate staring him in the face, and not responding to chemotherapy for his cancer, he did ask me to my great surprise, he asked me to edit the manuscript, put it together, and find a publisher. And I, of course, said, yes, I'll do that, Dad. And then after he died and the dust settled, I looked at the materials and I realized it was a partially completed manuscript and there's some big gaps. Although there are many, many, many boxes of materials, drafts, manuscript drafts, outlines, notes, correspondence, and so on. I thought, all right, well, I've got to do this someday, but when I retire, I'll do it. So almost 20 years elapsed, and one day I got a call from my little granddaughter, who was, I think, in 6th grade at the time, taking part in a class project where they were to ask their grandfathers about their father's participation in World War II. So I sat down and boy, it just flowed. The whole story, because my dad had related many of the stories related to his experience. And by the end of the 20 or 30 minutes, speaking with Natalie, I realized I have to do this. If I don't do it, nobody will do it. I had all the material. My dad had never really confided in my sisters. So I did. I got started, and I realized that the quality of the writing, at least in the initial chapters, was excellent. And the chapter on the the convoy battle was absolutely excellent. It just needed light editing. Some of the other
Sure.
chapters needed actually to be woven together. Notes and everything had to be woven together. But I was able to pick up on his style and his pace, and I think it turned out pretty well.
It did, definitely. Now, before we get into his story, could you tell our listeners briefly what Liberty ships were and in World War II, and what was their mission?
Yeah, well, your listeners know very well that the U.S. entered the war after we were attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. The Brits have been in the war for a couple of years by the point, and had lost a lot of shipping. As an island nation, they're very dependent on imports, and especially in the midst of war, imports of war material, as well as food and so on. They lost a lot of ships to the U-boat menace, and
Right.
President Roosevelt got together with the Brits, and they decided they needed to come up with a crash building program. The Brits had a design in mind that they felt would be suitable. It was they were called Liberty ships. The Americans gave them that name. They're about 400 feet long, about 27 feet in beam. They were slow. They had steam propulsion and could do a maximum of about 11 knots. But the advantage to this design was that it was a very simple design, and they elected to use a modular format where they would weld sections of the hull and then bring them together and weld them. No rivets, or very few rivets. Customarily, a ship would be riveted. They felt we can do this much faster with less skilled labor if we just use welds. And they also, thanks to Henry Kaiser, shipbuilding went to assembly line mode. And Henry Kaiser was well known. I think he was involved in the aluminum business initially, but he was kind of a brilliant man who just knew how to amp up industrial production. By the end of the war, the U.S. had produced 2,710 of these Liberty ships.
Wow.
By the way, the Nathaniel Greene was number 3. It was built in North Carolina, and launched. Was actually it was laid down before the war started, and was actually brought into service in April of 1942, before the U.S. had really become involved at all, except as far as convoy activity.
Yeah. Now, getting to your father's story in your research about his youth, were there things that you discovered, events or things in his character you discovered that prepared him for the challenges of war?
Yes, Rob, fundamentally, it was a matter of culture. Nowadays there seems to be a lot of talk about culture, particularly in the athletic sense, that a team takes on a football team takes on a certain culture where they toughness is expected, and putting the team first, and so on and so forth. And that was very much the case in my father's family growing up. His father had gone to sea in schooners starting at age 13. He actually fished off the Grand Banks for 3 years to support his family starting at age 13, and then spent almost 2 more decades in some of the big coal schooners that went back and forth between New England and Chesapeake Bay ports hauling coal.
Wow.
He was a real tough father. I remember him very well as a very loving, kindly grandfather, but he was a taskmaster, and he really, there were 6 boys and 1 girl in the family. Those boys were, I knew them all. They were a bunch of tough kids, and they grew up in a very tough section of Boston, virtually an Irish ghetto, and it was tough during the Depression era. So the culture within the family, within the community was tough. And Dad had to leave home at age 15 to support the family. He found himself at Camp Mansfield in Vermont as a 15-year-old, 3 years under the required age. He forged a birth certificate to get in, and he found himself being picked on because he hadn't started shaving. His voice hadn't changed. The older man called him Doris, and so he said he had to stick up for himself. So he went from that tough home environment to a tough CCC environment, and then went off to sea at age 16, working on ships with men from, the late teens to 40s, 50s, 60s and older. Very tough environment.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. Next time, former Air Force Colonel Mark Vlahos returns to the show to discuss the 60th Troop Carrier Group.
They were the most experienced C-47 group that we had. And from there, the 60th just had a string of firsts, hence leading the way to victory. They flew the first combat paratroop drop in North Africa as part of Operation Torch, the first combat glider tow during the invasion of Sicily, probably flew one of the first combat medical evacuation missions, in North Africa also.
Another reason to click that follow button so you'll be notified when the episode releases. Your father's unit aboard the ship, what was it and what were his duties aboard the ship?
Well, he was third mate, and so he stood watch, 2 4-hour watches a day. I'm not talking about during combat, but ordinarily, I think he was on the 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. watch, and then the 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. watch, ordinarily. And his job as a ship's officer was to supervise steering of the ship, navigation, just general supervision of crew activities. Now, once they became involved in combat operations, he was assigned to the stern gun post. At the stern of the ship, these Liberty ships were heavily armed. At the bow, there was a 3.5-inch gun. At the stern, there was a 4-inch gun. And the ship had numerous 50 cal Browning machine guns and Ehrlichon 20 millimeter anti-aircraft guns. So he was assigned to all the gunnery at the rear of the ship. His main job actually was to keep the ammunition flowing from the magazine up to that gun position. But the combat was so hot and heavy at times that he took his turn at a 50 cal machine gun himself.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of people have the idea in their minds that these Liberty ships were not armed like that and did not experience combat, that they were just sailing supplies across, the sea and back and forth, but no engagement. So that is definitely eye-opening. And that kind of leads me into my next question was, what, through your research and writing the manuscript, what do you believe your father's biggest test was at sea and in the war?
Well, as I discussed in the introduction to the book, Dad first started talking to me about his sea stories, his youthful experiences in the war, during long drives out to a farmhouse that my family bought at one point in the late 1950s. With the idea of renovating it and making it a vacation home or selling it. At any rate, Dad started to open up about his youthful experiences, and many of which were actually kind of comical. Some weren't so comical at all. They're very heartbreaking in a way. But he told me that on his first voyage as a 16-year-old galley boy on the SS Halo, an oil tanker, they were steaming past the Outer Banks, Cape Hatteras, and it was very hot. It was summertime, and one of the crew members suggested that they take their mattresses out of the cabins and put them on deck and sleep under the stars. So 3 or 4 of the younger ones did this, and everything was fine until in the middle of the night, a storm brewed up, and all of a sudden the ship is fighting its way into a headstorm, and my dad found himself floating in a virtual tsunami, and his mattress was swept off the stern of the ship, and he just barely grabbed onto a railing and pulled himself up, minus his mattress. He had to concoct make a mattress of old rags and stuff after that. Got some grief from the captain for losing ship's company.
Oh no.
That was, I guess you could say, that was a real life and death struggle. The rest of his pre-war maritime experiences were the usual sort of thing of occasional storms and unruly crew members, and fights and this thing and that thing, and all kinds of adventures ashore, and which I devote some time to, especially Dad's visits to Hamburg, Germany. He had some really, really wonderful experiences and eye-opening experiences there. Hamburg being one of the great seaports of the world, but also during the time of Hitler's takeover of power. He saw some things that were quite shocking to him.
Yeah, it's quite a city. I've been there, to Hamburg. That's for sure.
I plan to go someday. I just want to kind of revisit some of the spots that my dad visited 80 years ago.
I was there in the 90s. What is it you'd like to leave our listeners with about the story, and especially to entice them to pick it up and give it a read?
Yeah, well, Rob, there are many features of my dad's life and his biography that were really fascinating, including not only the merchant marine experiences, but riding the rails across the United States as an 18-year-old with his brother. They had truly some near-death experiences on that. But the heart of the story is really, I think it's chapter 11, where he describes the voyage to Archangel. It was after the voyage was completed, the Royal Navy said it was the biggest battle, at least to that point of World War II, the biggest convoy battle. You have to remember, Stalingrad was shaping up as a real pivotal battle at that time, and the convoy was bringing all kinds of war material the material that actually arrived in Archangel was being used on the battlefield days later. It was whipped down there very quickly by train, and tanks and ammunition and medical supplies were actually being put into battle. So that's the heart of the book. But the very, very core story that my dad told me once, and it brought tears to my eyes as a 12 or 13-year-old boy, was the ship next to his had been torpedoed. It was an ammunition ship, and it virtually blew up. It blew into millions of little pieces. It rained on his ship, almost destroyed his ship, and blew off much of the superstructure on his ship, the Green. The captain thought the Green itself had been torpedoed, and he ordered the men to get into the lifeboats, stop the engines, do a survey, and see if the ship could be saved. So they fell behind the convoy. They were in mortal danger because U-boats and planes would pick off any stragglers.
Sure.
And the captain, Dad said that the night before, Captain Vickers said, "Mr. Gill, I see that none of our American ships are flying the Stars and Stripes. I want you to make sure that Old Glory is flying from our masthead when we go into battle tomorrow." So in the midst of this, thinking the ship was sinking, my dad went to the flag locker, got out Old Glory, and ran it up the halyard, ran it up the mast. And all the crew saw this, and it inspired them tremendously. They started cheering wildly. They got out of the lifeboats and were determined. The captain took another look and said, "Okay, I think we can get back, rejoin the convoy." And they did. Slowly, they rejoined the convoy, and all the ships of the convoy cheered wildly as this battered Liberty ship that looked like it was going to go down rejoined the convoy. And as a consequence of that, and destroying 9 Nazi aircraft during the battle, or 8 during the battle, 1 later in the Mediterranean, the Green was awarded a gallant ship citation. 9 American merchant ships out of over 4,000, only 9 were named gallant ships. And there's a plaque at the Kings Point Merchant Marine Academy outside New York City. There's actually a room with plaques devoted to these 9 merchant ships, and they all have stories. I've read all their stories, and it's quite awesome, quite awe-inspiring.
And that's an awe-inspiring story. You painted the picture vividly.
Thank you.
The book is called Armageddon in the Arctic Ocean. Paul, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been great.
It's been my pleasure, Rob. Thank you very much.
That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for joining me. Next time, former Air Force Colonel Mark Vlahos returns to the show to discuss his new book on the 60th Troop Carrier Group.
They were the most experienced C-47 group that we had. And from there, the 60th just had a string of firsts, hence leading the way to victory. They flew the first combat paratroop drop in North Africa as part of Operation Torch, the first combat glider tow during the invasion of Sicily, probably flew the first one of the first combat medical evacuation missions, in North Africa also.
Another reason to click that follow button to be notified when the episode releases. And if you like what you hear, leave a review or a rating or just click the follow button. And be sure to check out our Point of the Spear YouTube channel with bonus video material plus full military history documentaries. There's tons to explore, and I hope you check it out. I'm Robert Child, and this has been Point of the Spear.
Music licensed from audioblocks.com. Point of the Spear is produced by RSC Media Group.